This was in the news this past week. Either Vladimir Putin was incredibly chivalrous or incredibly lecherous. And different news stories had different takes on it. But one place where you wouldn't find this story was in China, because this story of Putin putting his coat on the First Lady's shoulders was wiped from the internet. I was in China a couple years ago. This is from a documentary film festival in Guangzhou. And as I was walking out with someone else in the middle of a really elaborate orientation session, we stopped and took some quick photos. And some guys posted that on Weibo about how these incredibly rude Americans were leaving in the middle of this procession. And a friend of mine sent me the link and said, "Here, check this out." And I was like, "Oh no, this is horrible. I'm so embarrassed. I didn't want to do anything incredibly rude." And I said, "Did a lot of people see it?" And she said, "No, well, it's from a friend of mine who's an actor who posted it, so maybe 100,000 people saw that tweet." One reason I left was because on the side I was secretly running off and making little movies on my own the whole time I was there. This is from a little romantic comedy that I had done. I wanted to just kind of start being much more open about these projects that I was doing. Because when you're running a team, you don't want to tell everyone, "Oh, I'm going to spend all my weekends working on another movie." You want them to think you're there. Or at least that was my mentality. So I left my job and I went to Beijing, which was a city I hadn't been to before, and it felt like the future. I went because a friend of mine had an empty apartment, and I'm easily distracted, and I figured I could just lock myself away and write. I got there, but I didn't really know anyone, so I reached out to someone in Ai Weiwei's studio. Ai Weiwei had delivered a TED Talk a few years ago, which was recorded and smuggled out of the country, and it's really wonderful. And he's constantly someone who's whose voice is being suppressed by the government or by different elements in China. We just started talking casually. He said, "Well, what do you want to do while you're here?" And I was like, "Let's make a movie about a disaster scenario where a city runs out of water, and you can play a water smuggler. And it's not so much about just all of the drama of that, but maybe just a human story in the middle of it. And we'll make it so that it feels kind of just like a little hint of a feature film or something much longer." And that's what we set out to do. And we did. We went off, we shot this movie, and then I needed to pay for it. It was ridiculously expensive. I set up a Kickstarter campaign, and it went live, and right before the campaign was done, I got a cease and desist letter from Ai Weiwei's studio shutting it down. And so did Kickstarter, and they did. And it was shut down entirely. And I thought, what am I going to do? What in the world is going on here? Is he just joking around? Now, I thought, maybe it's the language that I used, right? There are all of these rules about what you can and can't do. And he's loved as, this outspoken voice about freedom, outside of China, inside of China, it's a very different story. So maybe I overplayed the fact that we shot the movie secretly, which we shot the movie kind of secretly. But, to be fair, we were discreet, and maybe no more discreet than if you made a little indie film without permits in America, although the repercussions, I didn't know what they would be. I assumed they would be stricter. Maybe it's because a lot of money was coming in, and people act weird when money rears its ugly head. That is 10,000 US dollars in Chinese currency, which I handed over to the local crew at one point. But he is kind of a joker. Right after we finished shooting, he performed haircuts on set. That's Christopher Doyle, the cinematographer, and me. That's what I look like afterwards. He didn't finish the job, but he gave us these matching complimentary haircuts that are not complimentary. Maybe in terms of being a joker, he actually changed one line of dialogue, which since we're at an elementary school, I won't get into the finer details of what he changed it to, but there's a certain expression that's often used when the government does something wrong or when something horribly scandalous happens that keeps popping up on his Twitter account and sort of in that world. And right when we were about to shoot this one scene, he said, "I don't think my character would say this. I think he'd say something else instead." And I didn't really my Chinese is limited. And I had heard that that was like maybe one of the most offensive things you could say. But I didn't know that there were multiple meanings to it, that the line that he says could have another connotation, one of them being sort of everything. Chinese is a language full of homonyms. There are multiple tones to each word. So you could say a word one way and it would mean one thing, and you could just, with the slightest inflection, it could sound like something else. So what he said could maybe sound like something that's completely innocuous and almost nonsensical, and maybe, and that's how it gets by the censors, is this kind of like jab back at something going wrong. What it also could allude to, which I think is incredibly powerful, is a personal story from his own life about how his father, Ai Ching, was a famous poet who at one point fell out of favor with the government and was sent to clean latrines for years near the edge of the Gobi Desert. And so what he's saying could also sound like, I'm going to take you to the edge of the Gobi Desert. And inspired by this, after he changed it, and once I knew all of these meanings, I actually decided I would go back and we would integrate it into the film itself and digitally enhance the world to fit what he had just said and bring this meme that only exists over in this parallel internet into this other environment. And it's the kind of thing that it's like, it's so sort of off color that it always sort of like gets a laugh. But none of that was really the most important thing going on when I went back and reflected on this film. While we were making the movie, pollution indexes rose to record levels. So there's an international scale of air pollution. It's 1 to 500. A smoggy day in Los Angeles is maybe 60 to 90. Above 300, they say stay indoors. It's not safe for children or the elderly. Caps at 500. When we were location scouting, this is the view from the hotel I was in. One of those days is a smoggy day. The other day is when it rose to over 800. And those are the conditions we were in. So we wore masks on set. Originally, it's kind of this dystopian story. So I figured, great, the characters they'll all wear masks. It'll be, part of this like interesting aesthetic. But we had to wear masks on set as well because of the pollution, not just because it was a cool aesthetic. And so I realized that's an important argument that needed to go out to the public. And, and I presented that. And fortunately, the Kickstarter campaign did kick back on. And we were able to pay for finishing the movie and paying all of the offset costs of making the movie. But through all of this, I learned all of these interesting nuances about how beyond the Great Firewall of China, which is the actual term that's used, there's a whole parallel internet with different sites that are similar to the sites that you may know, and different memes that are slightly nuanced and different than the ones that you may know. And it's really exciting to see that. And we often talk about putting something online and everyone everywhere will see it, but that's not the case. Like, there are these other internets and there are these other ways to, break down barriers that still need to happen. And what I was just showing you showed you these little examples of these little cracks in the Great Firewall of China. It also makes me think about one thing that I would often tell TEDx organizers and people about TED Talks and what our approach was when we created TED Talks, which was to give every single person the sensation that they have the best seat in the house, whether they're watching at home on their computer, watching on a handheld, or in the room. And I think that should apply to everything that you do in life. So thank you very much.